The Field of the Cloth of Gold took place 5 centuries ago in northern France, a few miles south of Calais. The site is still open country today, sparsely wooded and with scattered villages and huge modern farms. It is a landscape familiar from the Eurostar train to Paris or the A16 motorway. There are few towns. A small sign on the A16 encourages the curious visitor to turn off for Le Champ du Drac d'Or. I have to admit that I have never been tempted by it. Like so many sites of medieval gatherings, whether for peace or for war, this was an event which has left very few physical traces, and I suspect that if I had ventured down that road, there would have been almost nothing to see. As with the nearby battlefield at Crécy, this is a space rather than a place. It lives on in history as one of the great moments of English and French affairs. In brief, it was a meeting in June 1520 between Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France, two young kings with strong personalities. There was no particular agenda, and the meeting was held only to fulfill one of the conditions of a treaty made 2 years earlier. Nothing was negotiated there, and the mere fact of the meeting was the only thing accomplished. Meetings between medieval kings were relatively rare, particularly between French and English kings. Between 1300 and 1520, there had been only 3 such occasions, in 1313, 1327, and 1396. Although the Field of the Cloth of Gold was held over a century after the last of these, it belongs firmly to a tradition of medieval court festivals, to an existing culture of magnificence, and to a rich and venerable tradition of royal occasions. The Field of the Cloth of Gold was the indirect result of Pope Leo X's call for a new crusade against the Turks in November 1517. The Pope saw a universal peace in Europe as the essential prelude to such a venture. His plan was taken up by Cardinal Wolsey. The idea of the treaty also corresponded with the desire of humanists such as Erasmus for a universal peace. Wolsey, however, saw it primarily as a political weapon related to the rivalry between Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. The Treaty of London, agreed on October 8, 1518, provided for a framework which would support such a peace, and was duly ratified by many of the nations who were expected to support it. The main burden of ensuring its success was, however, down to the kings of England and France, who were the administrators of the terms of the treaty. As an essential part of the working of the scheme, it was specified in the text that the English and French kings should meet to declare publicly and in person their commitment to the terms of the treaty. The meeting was to be in place indifferent, in other words, on neutral ground. In Wolsey's detailed instructions, there is no signing ceremony and no oaths or affirmations. Instead, there is an elaborate protocol designed to ensure that the sovereign status of both monarchs is not infringed in the least detail. In particular, the chosen site on the border of France and the English enclave at Calais, is to become the place indifferent, a kind of no man's land. The fact of the meeting is all that needs to be achieved. The kings are to dine together with equal attention to protocol and dignity. Indeed, the heading of a memorandum of practical matters, drawn up not long before the meeting at Arges, simply describes it as an interview to be had between Henry VIII and Francis I, their queens, the Dowager Queen of France, who was Henry's sister, and Louise of Savoy, Francis's mother. Even though the only immediate purpose was this interview to be had, Wolsey's instructions make it clear that the event was conceived on the grandest scale. For as much as for the king's honour, it is behoveful and necessary to put everything into readiness, as well as for the apparel of his noble person, as for the garnishing of his lodgings, tents, pavilions, and preparations of all other things requisite to so great an act and triumph. This harks back to an idea that appears from the late 13th century onwards, that of royal magnificence. Today, magnificence is all too often associated with self-indulgence, but for medieval kings this was absolutely not the case. Magnificence, for them, was a virtue essential to kingship. The key to magnificence is a hugely popular text on the government of princes, written by Giles of Rome, a pupil of Thomas Aquinas. It was commissioned for Philip IV of France by his father, Philip III. For Giles, who based his ideas on those of Aristotle, magnificence is a virtue, and it is a monarch's duty to be magnificent. Most late medieval kings possessed a copy of this work, in Latin or the vernacular, and their festivals were one aspect of that magnificence. And the association of festivals and magnificence was to continue well into the 16th century. The festivals which formed an important part of the court culture of France under Catherine de' Medici were known as magnificences. There are two medieval festivals which foreshadow the proceedings at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. The first and most influential of these is the previous meeting between English and French kings, when in 1396 Charles VI brought his daughter Isabella to marry the recently widowed Richard II of England. The site chosen was exactly that used in 1520. Nigel Saul, in his biography of Richard II, says that it is possible that Henry and Francis took the earlier meeting as their model, and points to a vow by Richard and Charles, repeated by Henry and Francis, to build a chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Peace on the spot where they had met. Furthermore, the Mantuan ambassador, writing from the camp in 1520, tells us that the meeting was in a valley within the English Pale, called anciently the Vale of Gold, Val d'Oro. The author of the first printed pamphlet about the occasion, in July 1520, refers to the place as the Val d'Or. So this name predates the first use of the name Field of the Cloth of Gold, and almost certainly derives from the meeting in 1396. As we shall see, there are other details of the proceedings which follow what happened at Ard in 1396, and I would say that it is probable, rather than possible, that the parallels are deliberate. My second occasion is the wedding of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Margaret of York, sister of Edward IV, at Bruges in 1468. We have a description of this by its organiser, Charles's major domo, Olivier de la Marche. La Marche wrote a long letter to his opposite number, Gilles Dumas, in the household of the Duke of Brittany after the event. La Marche begins by saying that as Dumas is involved in organising festivals at the Breton court, I do not know whether there may be something in this noble festival of the wedding of my Lord of Burgundy which may be useful for you to remember at the right time and place. Among the similarities here are the use of temporary prefabricated buildings, the decoration of the interiors, and the luxurious costumes. A week of jousts followed the festivities, as was typical for a medieval royal wedding of the period. First, however, we need to look at the great commemorative picture painted for Henry VIII, which is now at Hampton Court. Sidney Anglo quotes an 18th century description of it, which says that it might as properly be styled a picturesque map as an historical picture. He goes on to analyse it with his customary expertise, showing how it is a compound over time of a series of events. The most prominent is the procession from the Castle of Guines on the left-hand side. The picture includes the first meeting of the two kings in the tent at the top, jousting in the lists, top right, and a banquet in a tent on the right. It is reasonably accurate as to the details of the palace and fountains in the foreground, but the composition as a whole has taken precedence over geography in the placing of the castle and in the perspective. There is a 19th century copy of the Hampton Court picture by Friedrich Buterweg, which is probably overcleaned. It is now at Leeds Castle. It gives a kind of early Technicolor film appearance to the scene, which is perhaps not entirely inappropriate. And thirdly, there is the engraving by James Bassier from a watercolour copy, which is shown here in the hand-coloured edition, printed by the Society of Antiquaries in 1990 from the original plates. This preserves details no longer clearly visible in the painting itself. For instance, the Great George badge of the Garter, which Henry wears, and the jewels under his hat. The picture is deliberately focused around the great palace created for Henry VIII, towards which the king rides. The palace was a very substantial wooden building, 100 metres square, with stone foundations and a brick base. The extensive glazing was a novelty. Its design was much admired. One of the most beautiful buildings in the world, the eighth wonder of the world. A contemporary remarked that Leonardo da Vinci himself, then at Francis's court, could not have done better. Such grandiose temporary structures recur in connection with royal festivals in the Middle Ages, from the 12th century onwards. When Frederick Barbarossa held court for the knighting of his sons at Mainz in 1184, the city was not large enough to hold the numbers he expected to attend, and a new wooden city was actually built outside the walls, including a palace with a very large chapel for the emperor's use. The gathering, which included most of the nobles of the early Roman Empire with large retinues, may well have been approaching 10,000 in all, in other words, on a similar scale to the numbers at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. We find temporary buildings at Westminster in 1308 for the wedding of Edward II and Isabella, where a strong, solemn hall was raised along the whole length of the wall of the palace on the bank of the Thames. It would have been about 150 metres long. And for the wedding of Charles the Bold, a great wooden hall was built at Brussels, 40 metres by 20 metres and 18 metres high. It fitted into one of the courts of his palace in Bruges and was brought there in sections by water. So prefabrication was nothing new. Two sources tell us that Henry's palace was built in this way, and at least part of it was taken across the Channel. One writer says that the whole building was dismantled and returned to England. Furthermore, a prefabricated building had been brought to Calais in May 1520. This was the remarkable roundhouse erected for Henry VIII's banquet for the Emperor Charles V when the two met that month. It was a theatre-like polygonal building, 120 feet across, with a central mast 135 feet high, supporting a canvas roof. The roof was destroyed by a storm before the building could be used. The chronicler Edward Hall, writing a decade after the event, provides his readers with a very comprehensive tour of the palace and its contents, as well as the practical offices attached to it. The furnishings were evidently as remarkable as the exterior. Alas, we have little specific detail. Hall talks of rooms lined with richly patterned silk, that no living creature might but joy in the beholding thereof. But he gives us little more in the way of description. The rich interiors were a great feature when Charles the Bold's palace in Bruges was made ready for the Duke's wedding in 1468. Lamarche writes at length of the works carried out to adapt the palace for the occasion, and of the layout and decor of the rooms, notably the dazzling chandeliers and mirrors. Viewing the rooms was an important part of the spectator's enjoyment of such occasions. We have another detailed unofficial account of the Bruges arrangements from Jean de Hénin, a provincial nobleman. Hénin lists an extraordinary number of major tapestries with new sets in each room, which, given the high price of tapestry, probably represented a costlier display than anything mounted by Henry. Robert Lamarck, Seigneur de Fleuranges, was among the entourage of Francis I, and tells us that the king had a house built in art, handsome enough for a townhouse, with large enough rooms. It seems it was not quite what he expected. The original intention was to give the feast for Henry in another structure, a wooden imitation of a Roman amphitheatre in shape, 3 stories high, covered in canvas. But in any case, it served no purpose, because it was never used. Francis evidently thought that he and Henry would meet in tents in the fields, and Lamarck praises the French tents with their rich materials and rooms and galleries within. A fine sight, he said. Francis and his companions evidently had no suspicion that Henry would create a grandiose palace in order to outdo them. Francis should have known better, because he and Henry were very conscious that the Field of the Cloth of Gold was a display of competitive magnificence, a new chapter in a long history of such rivalry between English and French kings, and the norm for royal occasions. This same rivalry can be seen at the knighting of Philip IV's sons in 1312, when Edward II came to Paris, and in milder form at the meeting of Charles VI and Richard II at Ardres. After 1520, there were no such face-to-face meetings between England and France, and the Field of the Cloth of Gold is the last of these extravagances. Two things distinguish the Field of the Cloth of Gold from previous festivals of this kind. Firstly, there is its sheer scale. The numbers involved exceeded those at any other such event in medieval Europe, with the possible exception of the gathering at Mainz in 1184. Secondly, there is its emphasis on the two kings and on their personal prowess. While England and France fought civil wars and the end of the 100 Years' War, Italian princes had reshaped the idea of magnificence in the mould of Roman imperial life, and had emphasized the role of the individual and his part in history. It is the personal relationship of Francis and Henry amidst all their glory which is one of the most interesting aspects of the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Francis saw Henry as a rival, but also as someone whom he wanted as a companion, on more intimate terms than protocol would allow. This is not the moment to investigate the character of Francis, but it is noticeable, for example, that the two kings never jousted against each other, but only fought the other's companions. It was only in an impromptu wrestling contest that they matched their physical strength. Furthermore, the insistence of observers on the physical beauty of Henry and Francis introduces a new element into the idea of kingly qualities, which would have had no place in medieval magnificence. It points forward to the different emphasis in later festivals. In the medieval period, the object was for the monarch to display his own magnificence. From the Renaissance onwards, and this may be a sweeping and untested generalization, the festival was in praise of the monarch, whose magnificence was taken for granted. Dress was a prime element of magnificence. In the mid-13th century, Alfonso X of Castile wrote that the ancients established the rule that kings should wear garments of silk adorned with gold and jewels, in order that men might know kings as soon as they saw them. In 1396, Richard II met Charles VI, arrayed in a long red velvet gown in the latest fashion, with a hat decorated with a mass of pearls as pendants, a rich collar in the French king's livery round his neck, and with his badge of the White Hart on his arm. Charles returned the compliment by wearing the same collar, badge, and hat, and a red velvet gown of a different cut. His gown was more elaborately patterned and came down to mid-thigh to display black and white breeches and black boots. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry VIII appeared in a silver doublet and a silver mantle overlaid with strips of cloth of gold, and wore the insignia of the Order of the Garter. Francis, like his predecessor, was the more fashionable of the two, with a slashed jerkin and shirt, also in silver and gold, embroidered with jewels. This quest for magnificence in dress applied not only to the kings, but to their entourages. It was a critical element in the competition for status. The most dramatic example of this mania for extravagant clothing is Charles the Bold. His purchases of materials were largely made through Tommaso Portinari, his Florentine banker. Portinari played a major role in the Burgundian court, both lending money to Charles and supplying him with the luxuries for which the Italian merchants in the Netherlands were famous. When it came to the vast amounts of splendid materials needed for the Duke's wedding to Margaret of York in 1468, Portinari's bill for silk, wool, and cloth of gold came to 53,773 livres. 5 years later, when Charles the Bold went to Trier in 1473 to try to convince the Emperor Frederick III to make him King of Burgundy, Portinari supplied cloths of carefully graded richness for 1,003 members of the Duke's retinue, for a total of 27,300 livres, excluding the clothing of the Duke and members of his family. Portinari himself was among the retinue. However, Frederick III was not impressed by Charles the Bold's fashion parade, and abruptly ended the meeting, ordering that his galley should row away without the usual ceremony of saying farewell. An exchange of gifts at diplomatic meetings was the norm. In 1396, as soon as the marriage treaty had been signed, Charles VI summoned the most skilful jewellers of Paris, and had ordered from them the costliest gold chains, bracelets, collars, rings, chokers and crowns, dresses of all colours and kinds, cloths of gold and silk, all decorated with various paintings, and precious stones, carriages, saddles, and harness of gold and silver for the horses. Among these treasures were special collars of Charles's personal emblem, seed pods of broom, set among green branches and flowers. Richard, for his part, used his badge of the White Hart with a gold collar and chain. The two kings exchanged these jewels, wearing each other's emblems as a sign of amity and alliance, as part of a massive exchange of gifts designed to underline the importance that the two sides attached to the treaty and to the marriage. Richard II is estimated to have spent between £10,000 and £15,000 on the meeting at Arges. The higher figure would be an eighth of the total value of the treasure he possessed at his abdication in 1399. Some of these gifts were almost a matter of etiquette. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, when Henry rode to the lists on the first of all the jousts, he admired Francis's horse, which had come from the famous stud of the Gonzaga Dukes of Milan. Francis immediately gave it to him, and Henry responded by presenting him with the Neapolitan courser which he was riding. 9 days later, they exchanged 2 horses each. Francis also gave Henry 6 coursers on another day, which Henry did not, or could not, reciprocate. Feasts punctuate all the events we have described. We know a great deal about the preparation and dishes of medieval feasts, thanks to the survival of a cookery book written by the chef of the Count of Savoy in the early 15th century. However, visual images of feasts are very disappointing, and even descriptions of the feasts tend to concentrate on numbers of dishes. Edward Hall merely offers a splendid generalization. Forests, parks, fields, salt sea, rivers, moats and ponds were searched and sought through many countries for the delicacy of viands. Accounts reveal that much money was spent. But feasts were far more than gourmet occasions. They were about etiquette and presentation, and they were dramatic as well. A tradition of entremets, originally special dishes served between courses, developed into short dumb shows and reenactments of great events, or the appearance of monsters and exotic beasts. The Field of the Cloth of Gold may not have had much of this sort of entertainment, which was going out of fashion, but it did have maskers, an ancient tradition which re-emerges in the 14th century with visors or false heads were worn by dancers. The maskers in 1520 were in the Italian style favoured by Francis. This was in contrast to Charles the Bold's wedding in the old style, for which La Marche offered full dramatic interludes based on the labours of Hercules, with scenery and actors as dumb shows during the feast. As to the atmosphere of the event itself, I will start with the elaborate regulations for security. Here, a comparison between the 1396 and 1520 proceedings is instructive. We have to bear in mind the long-standing mutual distrust between the French and the English. In 1396, the memory of war was fresh. So the carrying of arms in the neighbouring towns was banned, and no one was to follow the kings and their companies, particularly any food sellers or merchants. No games or sports which might lead to disputes were allowed, and musicians were only to play with official permission. All this was to avoid small arguments which might turn into larger disturbances. At night, watchmen were to patrol the camps, and searchers were to check the surroundings for suspicious persons. No troops on either side, other than those in the royal retinues, were to come within 2 days' march of the site. Yet the atmosphere in 1396 was quite relaxed. Nobles from both sides visited the other camp before the first meeting, inquiring what dress should be worn during the ceremonies. Richard is said to have replied, perhaps uncharacteristically, that the treaties already signed were a signal of the warm affection between both parties, and that luxurious clothes would in no way improve the existing relations. In 1520, there were real causes for suspicion, and we need to look briefly at these since they are essential for the understanding of the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Since the Treaty of Universal Peace had been signed in London, the high hopes for its success had been severely weakened. In 1519, the Emperor Maximilian died, and his grandson Charles V, who already ruled Austria, Burgundy and Spain, succeeded him. Charles had also inherited the Kingdom of Navarre, highlighted on the map, as part of Spain, which the Spanish had taken from the French in 1512. Francis had been in the French army, which tried unsuccessfully to recover it, and still claimed that it was his. Likewise, Francis hankered after the recovery of Naples, also highlighted, seized by Maximilian from Francis's father, Louis XII. While the French were eager to secure a closer alliance with Henry to secure themselves against the might of the Habsburg Empire, Henry saw that empire as a more formidable supporter for his own aims. Henry met Charles immediately before and after the Field of the Cloth of Gold. By 1522, the fragile Treaty of London had collapsed. England and the Empire were allies in an invasion of France. It is not surprising, therefore, that in the English preparations in 1520 there is much about sending out spies and counter-spies, and concern on both sides that the retinue of the other was larger. There is a wariness about the numbers of the two royal entourage, the possibility of treachery, and of quarrels breaking out between the respective servants. In the Hampton Court painting, Francis figures only as one of the two small figures in the tent, and possibly in the banquet scene at the right. This is the English version of the event. We have no royal record of it from the French side, but there is a once magnificent frieze in a great house in Rouen, dating from the 1530s. And this is the first encounter of the two kings, seen from the perspective of a member of Francis's entourage. In the event, when the two sides approached each other for the first actual meeting of the kings on June the 7th, 1520, both processions halted, each thinking that the opposite side was more numerous. It had been agreed that both companies should be equal, and that both suspected treachery, says much about the general atmosphere. It was only after envoys from both sides had carried out an inspection that the kings were reassured and moved forward. Francis and Henry met in the specially prepared pavilion, where they put on a great display of affection. I wonder if Wolsey gritted his teeth as he dictated the one paragraph of the memorandum for the preparations for the Field of the Cloth of Gold, which has nothing to do with his high diplomatic manoeuvres. He describes the serene princes as like in force corporal, beauty and gift of nature, right chivalrous in arms, and says that it seemed to us that to DECOR and illustre the same assembly, they should do some fair feat of arms, as well as on footback as on horseback, against all comers. But this is more than the icing on the cake, a way of keeping his young master happy. The tournament, as a sport, had only become respectable towards the end of the Middle Ages. It was often an adjunct to state occasions, officially or unofficially, simply because such gatherings brought together a large number of knights for whom this was an opportunity to practice their favourite pastime. Jousts, however, played a different part at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Interestingly, this is a trend which emerges in the 14th and 15th century. Tournaments, which technically involved a general melee of all the participants, had moved from being actually illegal to an activity usually attached to great assemblies. When kings began to joust officially in the 13th century, tournaments became part of court life. Emphasis on individual prowess and the danger of fighting in a general melee meant, though, that by the time tournaments were respectable, jousting predominated. After the death of Charles the Bold, the chronicler Georges Chastelin compiled a list of his 12 magnificences, in which he praises the celebrations for Charles's wedding as one of these. It is magnificent, firstly, for the rich and sumptuous jousts which were held there, and only after that for the various luxurious excesses and displays of pomp in the hall. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, this change of priorities is complete. Rich and sumptuous jousts are the main focus of the whole event, rather than an adjunct to it, and the nebulous interview to be had is merely the background to them. The fair feat of arms, which Wolsey prescribes, is in fact a very specific type of tournament. The French name for it is a pas d'armes, and the ritual is that one knight and his companions undertake to defend a place, marked by a stone or perron, usually accompanied by an elaborate declaration in high literary style as to why they are doing so. No such document survives for the Field of the Cloth of Gold, but all the other ceremonies surrounding the pas d'armes were observed. These began on Saturday, June the 9th, when the Tree of Honour was set up at the end of the lists. On the tree, the shields of challengers and defenders were hung. Below these were the 3 shields which indicated where the heralds stood to write down the names of those who came to joust. It was 10 metres high and 15 metres wide, covered with both green and withered leaves. The green leaves were of damask and the withered leaves of cloth of gold. The tree bore raspberries and hawthorn flowers, wrought in kindly wise with silver and Venice gold, the emblems of Francis and Henry. This may sound like a tree, but I have to point out here that the artist has got the scene entirely wrong. It was in fact a kind of scaffold supporting the scoreboard, built with straight timbers as branches. It was no more a tree than a clothes horse is a horse. We have a fully detailed account of the jousting in the pamphlet published in 1520. The rate at which courses were run and spears shattered varied widely from one event to the next, and the Field of the Cloth of Gold was notable for the number of spears broken. In 5 days of actual jousting, spaced over 10 days, the score was 283 broken spears. This was serious and impressive sport, Henry being a more expert jouster than Francis, and scoring 11 spears against his 7 on the 2 days when they entered the lists. It was, however, modest compared with the highest rate I know of, that of Gaston IV, Count of Foix. In jousts at Barcelona in 1455, he broke 82 lances during the event. His opponents broke 75 lances in these encounters, for a total of 157 lances involving a single jouster. We have a detailed account of the jousting in a pamphlet published in 1520, with a full list of the combatants and the results of each course. The rate at which courses were run and spears shattered varied very widely from one event to the next. The jousts at the Field of the Cloth of Gold were notable for the number of spears broken. In 5 days of actual jousting, spaced over 10 days, the score was 283 broken spears. This was serious and impressive sport. Henry was the more expert jouster. He scored 11 spears against Francis's 7 on the 2 days when they entered the lists. Nonetheless, in the overall scale of things, this was relatively modest. The most successful jouster that I have been able to find was Gaston IV, the Count of Foix. At jousts in Barcelona in 1455, he himself broke 82 lances, and his opponents broke 75 lances on him. Scores were kept on jousting checks, and this is a fine example which actually comes from the Field of the Cloth of Gold itself. Even while the Field of the Cloth of Gold was in progress, letters were sent out describing its marvels. Once it finished, the new art of printing meant that word of its magnificence spread quickly. By the end of the following month, 3 detailed accounts of the ceremonies had been published in Paris. All 3 derived from a single eyewitness account, probably written by Guillaume Boudet, royal librarian to Francis I, who knew the king well. This version is the ordering and order of the tournaments, jousts, combat on horseback and on foot, and contains the list of combatants and their scores in each session, as well as a description of the whole proceedings. And when Edward Hall came to write his chronicles of the union of the houses of York and Lancaster, running from the accession of Henry IV to the death of Henry VIII, he devoted more space to this occasion than to any other single event. Hall drew on the French accounts, English official papers and records, and the memories of men about court who had been present. The fame of the meeting between Francis I and Henry VIII near Calais was spread abroad by the detailed reports sent home by Italian and Spanish diplomats. So it passed into history as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of the festivals in which an English king was one of the protagonists.